Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is part one of Spill the Wine. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so continuing our exploration of the elimination of the Vikings from history and the role it could play in today's identity politics nightmare, it's finally time to mix it up with the juice, William Godwin, whom we already know a few things about. Aside from the interesting things happening with his dates, we know that he was a journalist and a novelist and a political philosopher, philosophizing so much on politics that he is now remembered as the first modern anarchist. And an anarchist, of course, is one who promotes anarchy, which has as diametrically opposed a double meaning as you could imagine. Right? There's no way that this is not on purpose. The curators of the spell book definitely appreciate irony, because the flip side of anarchy's lawless chaos is voluntary communal cooperation. It's hard to get more opposite than that. And the word was once more popular than it is today, according to Google. And it's interesting it was so popular when there were far fewer people in the world, let alone those educated enough to know or use a word like anarchy. And this is made even more interesting by the use of the word anarchist, which doesn't take off until what looks like the 1880s, sort of parallel with the story of the word Viking, right? Used a certain way for so long, and then come the mid-1800s, it's used a different way. Because this late usage of the word makes me wonder what all of those proponents of what anarchy was in the late 1700s called themselves. But regardless, some of Godwin's ideas make him the first one, right? So we also know that the Juice was married to the undertaking zombie she-wolf Mary Wollstonecraft, and that made him father to Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, which Mud City now sees as an important bridge between the Royal Society and Gen Pop. It's an opening for their new scientific ideas into the public subconscious, which has already been softened by religion and Judeo-Christian stories of miracles and heroism. Right? It was all too easy for the Royal Society to use tales of the fantastic like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the works of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells after her, just to name a few. They used these stories to juice in its ideas for expanding the empire, which include forcing its education and scientific agenda on the public through legislation, right? And it's here at this early stage in the rollout that we find the juice, right? And the Royal Society is going to use ideas credited to him to shape the future of the empire. But how did he get there, right? Adding to the enigma of the juice, as far as the mainstream narrative is concerned, his family just sort of drops out of the sky in the late 1600s. Because using the gatekeeping genealogy sites that I do, I can only go as far back as his grandparents. And though we're going to touch on both sides of his family, I think Falcon's Maze for William Godwin is best served by starting with his paternal line. Right? Both his father and his grandfather were dissenting ministers, essentially very vocal Protestants opposed to a Catholic crown. And what's interesting here is how this could connect him to the Poe story, other than, of course, that possible blood relation we saw, right? Because dissenting is just the English version of Scottish covenanting, which the immortal David Poe and his masked friend the prophet Alexander Payton were all about. And all of this goes back to the First English Civil War, which of course goes back to the Reformation and the real vehicle behind social control, the illusion of choice. All right, and so the Juice is raised in this dissenting environment, and he attends dissenting schools where some of his teachers will go on to become lifelong friends, right? And like his father and grandfather before him, he takes up the pulpit to pay the bills. But preaching the gospel really isn't his thing, right? He has doubts about the nature of God, and he can't keep himself from philosophizing, right? So when he gets sacked by his congregation in 1782, he heeds his friends and former teachers' advice and moves to London to become a writer. And his friends and former teachers introduce him to the men paving the way for the Royal Society. Men like John Murray or the brothers Robinson and Joseph Johnson, who does have a historical likeness. Maybe not as appealing as Joseph Fiennes, but here he is. Right? So, and more on these guys later, right? But these ties and the fact that the Juice is a natural, an extremely well-informed commentator on contemporary affairs, right? And he gets published in numerous political journals right out the gate, right? Building his reputation until 1793, when he uncorks his best 1-2 punch by releasing his political magnum opus, right? A book called Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, right? And then, right on the heels of that, the next year, his fictional masterpiece, a book called Things as They Are, The Adventures of Caleb William, Remo's great-great-great-great-grandfather. and of course, this book is little more than political allegory. But wouldn't you know it, it just so happens to be the first thriller, where the Juice introduces the plot device of revealing the ending first and working the story backwards. A plot device hailed by our friends EAP and Chucky D, naturally, right? And it's just incredible that the Juice would write the first thriller and his daughter would write the first modern science fiction novel. Talk about pedigree or something, I don't know. But regardless, these two books usher in ideas that are going to be used to shape our current identity politics nightmare. And the success of these books makes William Godwin a central figure in radical political and literary circles in London, right? It's the age of enlightenment and revolution, right? And those types love the Juice, right? And the main body of his ideas revolve around one basic principle, that reason and not emotions or feelings should be the governor of men. And the road to reason is paved by maximizing pleasure and individual happiness. How is mankind to progress if every man, woman, and child isn't pleased or happy? Right? And it's this basic idea that the Royal Society and its minion clubs like the Philosophical Breakfast Club and the X Club are going to use to subtly change society to one that favors their plans. Foreshadowing the later calls of the keymaster Norman Lockyer, William Godwin believes that the best delivery system for his ideas is education. And for a time, he was publisher of his own brand of textbooks for children. And more on that later. But in his anthology of conversational essays on education, manners, and literature, which was published in 1797, he lays out the blueprint for the Royal Society and the sundry groups to follow. In naturally his very first essay, right, which is called Of Awakening the Mind. With so much of our identity politics disaster centering on wokeness, right, do you think it's a coincidence that his first essay on education is called Of Awakening the Mind, right? And he leads with nothing less than the mission statement of education itself. All right, this is just unbelievable, right? Okay, so here we go. All right, the true object of education, like that of every other moral process, is the generation of happiness. So not the imparting of knowledge and skill, but the generation of happiness, right? Happiness to the individual in the first place. If individuals were universally happy, the species would be happy. And so right here in 3 miniaturized sentences, he spills it all out there. Right? The object of education is not creating a well-informed, rational population or society, right? It's keeping them happy. All right, so he continues, all right, man is a social being. In society, the interests of individuals are intertwisted with each other and cannot be separated. Right? Men should be taught to assist each other, as if helping each other isn't a part of human nature. Right? The first object should be to train a man to be happy. Train him to be happy. Not only do they need to be taught to assist each other, right? They need to be trained to be happy. Because of course, man is incapable of generating his own happiness. Right? And so the second object is to train him to be useful. That is, to be virtuous. And so to bring this to the present, just how useful did all the pandemic virtue signalers believe they were, right? Or still are, those that are still out there, right? There is so much to unpack here, right? And this is just page 1, essay 1, right? The admission that the purpose of education is not to create a well-informed population, but a happy one feels a little like a smoking gun to me, right? Because the concept of happiness is as subjective as it is arbitrary, right? Who is the arbiter of happiness in this scenario? Whose version of happiness are the people to be taught? Because mankind clearly needs to be trained in this. And this also speaks to what the erudite and above thought about the plebes, right? And the future populations coming down the pike, right? They were empty vessels. And I love how this plays into the population reset idea. How is it possible that a man, and I'll be a little more politically correct here, how is it possible that a person ever didn't understand what made them happy? Or how to help their loved ones, friends, family, fellow cave dwellers, right? What have you. If there's millions of years of human evolution behind them, and of course, evolution is an idea that's still like 50 years away from this point, right? And why would they need training in how to be happy? They would need training for one of two reasons, the way Mud City is looking at it, right? And one would be that the people are literally empty vessels with no understanding of who they are or their emotions or anything. And the other would be that the concepts of happiness or assistance or morals and virtue that were already in place weren't up to snuff. They either A, weren't good enough, or B, state approved, and whomever was coming in to take over, right? And so whether it's filling starter population vessels being bred, raised, and shipped out of the giant warehouses in Baltimore as Mud City favors, right? Or the anticipation of a large natural population spike, the narrative of the late 1700s, right? Really through the early 1900s, is all about prepping the people for the future, their future. So if it's your goal to create this society of happy individuals, you need to give or present these individuals options, right? If there's only X limited number of things to be happy about, love of God, country, and family, whatever, right? Too many people are going to be happy about the same things, right? And will function less as individuals and more like communities. And this will not do, right? Because the individual needs to be happy foremost, and only then can the species be happy. And of course, the Juice knows a lot of people willing to help provide some of this happiness, including himself, people called publishers. And one of the ideas that the society wants promoted by these publishers is romanticism. Because what greater cause for happiness and personal joy has God bestowed upon his faithful servants other than romance, right? And the celebration of all things beautiful, right? And creator of an unsustainable standard for sexual relationships. And the Juice, of course, was intimately involved in the romantic movement. He was an early proponent of free love and promiscuity and disdained the institution of marriage until he knocked up the Undertaker, who suddenly found the institution more acceptable herself, staring down the barrel of two illegitimate children from different fathers. And he was also very close with Percy Shelley, whom he allowed to abscond with his 16 or 17-year-old daughter, right? There is a lot of work to do on the romantics and how they could be part of realm-wide MK Ultra type program that the Royal Society was running, with the help from people like the Shaftesbury's and their madhouses, right? And so by creating and promoting this romantic love separate from the love of God and family, which ostensibly was the only type of love that people knew, right? And grounding that love to the physical plane through experience, it has potential to be a gateway for the other interests of the physical realm to take precedent over God and family. And this is another of these central conceits of Mud City borrowed from Flat Earth, that many of these great conspiracies are attempts to distance us from understanding our Creator, whoever or whatever that may be. But given the Judeo-Christian historical narrative model, I have to work with, we're just going to go with God, right? Just for, sake of argument or whatever, right? But more specifically, we're talking about the church. And so before we get into all of this and the deeper symbolic nature of William Godwin's connection to modern identity politics, I want to close this one out by looking at another way the Juice may be connected to a false Viking narrative through his mother's side of the family, which again, I could only bring back as far as his grandfather, one Richard Hull, who was a man of some means in the 1700s because he was and get this, Right? He was a ship owner and a seafaring merchant active in the Baltic Sea trade, which at one point in history would have made him a Viking. Literally. It hardly seems a coincidence, right? And it's money from this side of the family that keeps the juice in his private dissenting schools. And the amazing thing about this occupation for Richard Hall is that in this capacity, he could have made it all the way to Russia and these other exotic locales, making him a perfect candidate to be one of Mud City's ghosts in the machine. You know, Mud City is filled with the unsung tales of nameless men doing the dirty work, asking their supervisors why they're throwing ball bearings and belt buckles all over an empty field. Or they question who is ever going to believe the nonsense that they were being forced to write down in all these books, only to be told to shut up and get back to work. Every once in a while, the narrative presents me someone that fits the bill. You know, like Josiah Pennington, right? And some of the other Penningtons for that matter, right? And it's hard to find a more perfect fit than Richard Hull, because being a ship-owning Baltic seafaring merchant would be the perfect cover for the dirty job Mud City just assigned him. And naturally, that would be burying freshly minted Viking artifacts all across the Baltic Sea region for future generations to find. You know, burying stashes of coins and jewelry like Aethelwulf's ring. Things that will back up the false Viking narrative that's being cooked up, right? Because that's all they're really finding, right? They're not finding any large Viking settlements or many of the large ships for that matter. All that's really being found are trinkets, and most of those are being found by amateur metal detectorists. And so this idea of Richard Hall, the Juice's grandfather, burying all these artifacts just makes my fat senses all tingly and happy, right? And because not only do we get this Viking component over here on his mother's side, we know the history through his father's side of the Godwin name back to the Anglo-Saxon kings of England. The Vikings' companion story, the Anglo-Saxons, right? But is there even more to it than that? You know there is, right? And we're going to take a closer look at that and a whole lot more in the next barrel-filling episode, if you were so inclined. But before we go, I have a quick cherry to put on the top of this one, right? And that's when I was talking about the concept of romance as a gateway for other earthly distractions, I ran the word through a gematria calculator, and sure enough, in the Hebrew gematria, you can get an 11. All right, so that's all I have for this one. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers.